I might have to put on another layer. Welcome to Monstrosities Mon Amour, the show where we all get to flirt shamelessly with unloved places. I'm John Grindrod, a writer on a mission to disappoint. I just climbed to the top of the clock tower of Crisp Street Market in Poplar, East London, with a historian of art and architecture, Professor Rosamund Lily West, when she coshed me over the head with a copy of the official guide to the Royal Borough of Greenwich and dumped me in the boot of her Austin Maxi. Rosamund, where the flipping hell are we?
So we are heading towards the Blackwall Tunnel on the Blackwall Tunnel approach road from the southern side, of course, because that's the side I'm from. So we're in the sort of East Greenwich, the kind of industrial East Greenwich, heading towards the Greenwich Peninsula.
Yeah, and we are surrounded by a lot of industrial buildings and sort of industrial wasteland still, which is, considering this whole area, like in my mind, this whole area is sort of super sparkly and rebuilt and millennial. And then actually in real life, it's not so much, is it?
No. And I think that's kind of what's really interesting about, part of what I find the Blackwall Tunnel interesting, but also this part of East Greenwich I find really interesting is the layers on it, which is really fascinating. The different periods, but also the layers of the road, the kind of the flyover that goes over your head in East Greenwich, which really puts this literal shadow on East Greenwich and makes that kind of industrial and also Victorian houses kind of area even a little bit grim. And I found that really interesting. And then, you go further north onto the Greenwich Peninsula and you've got all this, this new IKEA. Right at the top, you've got the design district and it's all very kind of flashy. And then you have little pockets of, there's an old Edwardian school, if you look very carefully. There's older post boxes. So there's little clues that there was things going on there earlier. So I find that layering very interesting. And also in my head, and I know everybody has this about where you're from or places you know well, there's different layers in my head as well of that place. From it now, I've worked in that area from when I was a child. And also you kind of pick up your parents and generations back memories of it as well. So I have inherited memories from that place.
Yeah, absolutely. But really interestingly, the place that you've chosen is the tunnel, the Blackwall Tunnel itself, which is a place that you're going to have very specific memories of because you can only travel through it. Your experience of that tunnel presumably is pretty linear.
Yeah, yes. There's only a sort of one way really you can experience it, which is going through in a car or on a bus, on the 108 bus. In a way, it's kind of silly that I've chosen Blackwall Tunnel because I don't actually drive. So when I've been through it, either a bus driver has driven me or I've been in a car. And I'm not in a car very often, but as a child, my sort of predominant memory is my dad driving us through it. And I just found it really fascinating, partly because as a child, I didn't quite understand a tunnel through the river because it's called the Blackwall Tunnel through the river. So I thought it was this sort of floating snake-like thing through the river and I imagined that we were getting sort of battered by the tides. And my dad always used to say, oh, look, the ceiling's leaking, to add this layer of peril and excitement through it. And he used to get us to hold our breath in case it bust through and the river came in. So I had this completely inaccurate, fantastical idea of what the tunnel actually was. And quite late in my life, as a child, I realised that it's not actually in the water, that it is beneath the water in the ground.
Yeah, it's not quite as Jules Verne as it makes it sound, is it? That?
No. But I think as well, it's a very long tunnel, and on a car journey, I guess for children, that is a little bit exciting. And I found the lights exciting, the glazed bricks. It was just a different experience. There's nowhere else quite like it in your everyday life. And as a pedestrian, you can't, walk through it. So the only way I experienced it was on a car journey. And often we would be going somewhere exciting, somewhere sort of north of where we were. So often we would be going on holiday or something like that, going further up the country. So it had this quite probably unrealistic element of excitement in it for me as a child. Growing up in the area I grew up in the borough of Greenwich. So much of people's lives, the culture, the roads, everything, the road signs is about the Blackwall Tunnel. And so you hear those words, Blackwall Tunnel, over and over again. And I remember people saying if someone was a bit loud or mouthy, they'd say, oh, they've got a mouth like the Blackwall Tunnel. So it's one of those places like Blackpool Illuminations that has entered the language.
Yeah, and it's funny that, isn't it? It's really well known by people who will never experience it. because it's actually buried underground or underwater. So it's sort of invisible. So you can't kind of see it. Yet its reputation has spread like enormously. It's become a byword, and yet people don't even know what it refers to.
When I was a child, I'd get told to turn lights off, and I'd say, "This isn't Blackpool Illuminations." And I've still never been to Blackpool Illuminations, but I know I need to turn a light off if someone says Blackpool Illuminations. So yeah, I guess the same thing. It's a sort of byword for something else. And often, another thing that's interesting about Blackwall Tunnel is it's often a negative reason why it's being mentioned, because of the traffic, because it's blocked. Now, more recently, because you have to pay. So part of what I find it really culturally fascinating is because so many people hate it, and it has such a negative connotation to people as well.
It's got a really long history because it's actually 2 tunnels, isn't it? It's not one tunnel. So the name itself is entirely misleading.
The original ideas for a tunnel were kind of conceived under the Metropolitan Board of Works, and the famous Joseph Bazalgette of sewer fame came up with the idea of 3 tunnels, 1 pedestrian and 2 traffic. And then the Metropolitan Board of Works got quite far kind of with this idea of what is now Blackwall Tunnel. But then the LCC takes over in 1889 and inherits this very expensive, complicated project. And then under the chief engineer of the LCC, Alexander Binney, and also the contractor is S. Pearson and Sons of Westminster, who were also building the Hudson River Tunnel at the time, which is quite interesting. So it was constructed between 1891 and 1897, and then it's opened to great ceremony on the 22nd of May, 1897, by the Prince and Princess of Wales, who later become Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. So it's this great feat of engineering. And 1897 is interesting because it's, towards the end of the Victorian period. It's after other crossings like Tower Bridge is only 3 years before. Then you've got the Tower subway in the 1860s, which is kind of superseded by Tower Bridge, really. And then you've got the Thames Tunnel in the 1840s. But the Blackwall Tunnel is so significant because obviously it's connecting these 2 very major industrial areas of London, East London and South East London. So it's a really major, kind of really important connection. And so it is quite an old tunnel, and the original tunnel is 1 tunnel, and if you go northbound, you're going through the old tunnel, and that was for traffic. So it's a kind of mixture of horse-drawn traffic, barrows, very kind of busy, going 2 ways. But by the 30s, road traffic's really increasing. And so the LCC wants to build another tunnel. This is kind of obviously delayed by the Second World War. And the second tunnel, which is what you are using if you come southbound, that was started in, I think, 1958, and then that was opened in 1967. So if you're coming southbound, you can see the inscription above the tunnel with mentioning Desmond Plummer and the GLC and the date. So now there's 2, as you said, it's really the Blackwall tunnels, but there's 2 separate tunnels, 1 totally northbound, 1 totally southbound.
On the north, it comes out East India Dock, and that's a reminder of the reason why it needed to be a tunnel, isn't it, and not a bridge, is that at that point in the river, you've got an enormous amount of dock traffic happening, all of these kind of industrial ships going up and down, with container ships and sort of big, really, really big ships coming up and down. They couldn't construct a bridge over that point, and Tower Bridge becomes the sort of last bridge for, many years, doesn't it, in London. Its position is the reason it is a tunnel. That is also fascinating, isn't it? That it is very site-specific. It wasn't an option to build a bridge there.
Yeah, and that's part of, going right back to the Metropolitan Board of Works, thinking about this tunnel. By the middle of the 19th century, I've read different statistics. Some say it's 1/3, some say it's 2/5, which is about the same. Let's just say a lot of London's population lived east of London Bridge. And this is a very heavily populated, very industrial area. And the need to cross 2 sides of the water is really important in terms of sort of trade and industry, but also sort of less financially important, I guess, people just moving across. In terms of sort of socially and culturally, the Thames has always been this great, and this kind of remains in some ways, this great divide in this part of London, this sort of uncrossable divide because the river is so much wider. So the predominance of river traffic dominates. And you see that, don't you, in the architecture of Tower Bridge in 1894. That can be a bridge because it opens. And I think still today it's the case that river traffic dominates. Road traffic will stop to allow a boat to come through. And yeah, so that's why the Blackwall Tunnel is a tunnel and doesn't get in the way. And the engineering feat of it it's kind of remarkable, really. At the time, it was the longest underwater tunnel in the world. It's really impressive piece of engineering. And it's also quite impressive that we're still using it 130 odd years later.
It's really interesting that you have a memory of, it being very much part of your life, a sort of sense of escape through it. But the thing that I think is really notable about it is that at either end of the tunnel, you've got these incredible sort of modern construction projects going on, haven't you? On one side, as you're going into it, oh, hello, it's the Millennium Dome, it's the O2, it sort of like gives you a little final wave as you're going under. And then as you come out, the other end, you're coming out into a district where, we would have had Robin Hood Gardens, that amazing kind of modernist estate by Peter and Alison Smithson that was there. And also we're right by Poplar as well, which is another one, it's part of the Festival of Britain. Really, that whole area is so interesting, connecting those two completely different but really, really exciting bits of construction in modern London. And it feels like the tunnel actually enables those things to actually happen.
Yes, yeah. I think the way that the tunnel kind of bridges these different worlds and these different meanings of the architecture as well is really interesting. Starting on the south side, as you said, you've got the Millennium Dome. You've also got sort of scraps of kind of post-industrial landscape. You've got, if you look carefully, you've got remnants of when this was, because I think we forget that before it was this sort of millennial village, it was a very industrial area, but also a lot of people lived there. So you do see, if you look carefully, scraps of evidence of people living there on this very industrial site. So right by the Blackwall Tunnel approach is an Edwardian school as well. So that gives you evidence that there were families here that were all moved out in the 60s because it was so industrial. But yeah, then you sink underground and then you come out on the other side. And you really, I always remember as a child having a real kind of impression of the buildings shadowing over us, like Balfont Tower. And as you say, you've got Robin Hood Gardens and that very famous kind of wall to screen off the sound that the Smithsons cleverly kind of put in, dealing with that really difficult site. So yeah, on the northern side, there's a lot more housing, whereas on the southern side, that housing has all gone and we've kind of forgotten about it. There's newer millennium housing. But yeah, you've got Balfont Tower, you've got Robin Hood Gardens, you've got the Brownfield Estate. And also, I've never thought about it till you said that kind of festival link is interesting. Because obviously on the north side, you've got Poplar with the Festival of Britain. So, one can imagine a lot of visitors to that from my side of the river would have been coming through the tunnel. But it's also interesting that later, around the turn of the millennium, you've got, as you said, the Millennium Dome, which has deliberate kind of references to the Dome of Discovery on the South Bank at the Festival of Britain. So it's a lot of it is this kind of quite fantastical, quite ambitious architecture in two areas that historically have been very industrial, quite dirty, grimy, working class kind of places, but really fascinating and interesting and with real kind of a really important kind of industrial heritage. And, areas like this were really the kind of powerhouse of London. And the reason why London was such a big, powerful city, and the country as well, the industry and the money that was coming through the docks, coming through the Port of London. It really, another thing that I think is interesting about the Blackwall Tunnel is it really emphasises the river, because the river is so important to London, but particularly in this part, it's so important. It's the reason why a lot of us are here, because of their industry and everything, but also the width of the river, this sort of impenetrable passing, and that this kind of mental barrier as well that the river has is really fascinating, and again feeds into the Blackwall Tunnel, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And because we are in East London as well, this has sort of been historically quite a poor area. It's extraordinary to have this enormous infrastructure project from the sort of Victorian era for what was quite a poor area. And it's a complete sort of side, bonus for people living around there, that actually they can use it, because as you say, it's sort of foremost was for industrial purposes, foremost for all of those docks, for all of that material being kind of shipped around the country, being unloaded or loaded onto these ships. Suddenly, a lot of working class people had access to this really super modern, very exciting bit of infrastructure. We don't really see that happening in a lot of London. Those infrastructure projects don't tend to favour a kind of working class inhabitant generally, do they?
No. And I think again, I think what's really interesting about the various river crossings in London is there's definitely a kind of class issue. There is definitely in this side of London a real chip on the shoulder about all those up west with all their bridges. You can't, you can barely move for bridges, and they're all beautiful and they're all free. Everyone rants about this. And then, further east, there's barely any crossings. And, now you have to pay for the Blackwall Tunnel, the new Silvertown Tunnel. Yeah, okay, it's a new tunnel, but you've got to pay for that. Still have to pay for the Dartford crossing out in Kent. The Woolwich ferry is a free crossing, but there's one fewer boat now since 2019, and it's often shut. So, yeah, there's always this rumbling chip on the shoulder that all the sort of posh lot up west got all these lovely bridges, and that's not the same situation. Obviously, it's because the river is wider. It's not a sort of penalising thing. But, yeah, there's always this grumbling kind of chip on the shoulder about that, which is kind of quite interesting, quite fun as well. I always find it really fascinating when I walk along the river, looking over at Tate and Lyle and seeing the ships unloading there. It's really fascinating, partly because you don't see that much anymore. In my lifetime, the river, I guess, is still a working river, but barely. But yes, of course, it was a much busier river. And it always strikes me when you go further up west, it just doesn't feel like the same river, not just because of the bridges, but because it's so kind of bucolic and beautiful. And it feels like a river in, a lovely kind of home counties town. I remember the first time I kind of really walked around the river up that way, sort of out the west of London. I remember it really struck me. It even smells different. It's such a different river. It's really interesting. It's like two completely different beasts.
One of the few things that makes the tunnel visible are Terry Farrell's air duct chimneys, which really make a sort of really big impact on the skyline, but particularly on the dome. I mean, that's sort of incredible how it was integrated into that.
Yes. Oh, I mean, they're listed, but they're very kind of 60s and space age, and they do fit in with the dome, because that is also a little bit 60s and space age, let's be honest. And I find that really interesting. The kind of infrastructure of the Blackwall Tunnel reflects the Victorian and the 60s, the two tunnels. As you said, these are the Blackwall tunnels. And I think it's really interesting how the infrastructure shows not just the sort of fashion or the vogue of the time, but it shows the importance in this crossing. I really love going north from the south side, and you still have, unfortunately it's not on the northern side, but you still have the original gatehouse from its opening in 1897. And it's this red and yellow brick Scots baronial arts and crafts kind of really quite attractive gatehouse, and it's sturdy and it's big, and you feel that you are entering something. It's an experience, and it shows that this is an important bit of infrastructure, and it has this very Victorian kind of civic pride about it, which is really kind of interesting. And it has Blackwall Tunnel 1897 above it, and the Terry Farrell kind of ventilation shafts, and the 60s sort of entrance on the other side. The architecture and the kind of the bigness and the largeness of it is really interesting.
And I do always think it's fascinating that the reason that the dome has always had that sort of slightly Death Star look to it, because of that big crater, is it's actually one of the ventilation shafts of the tunnel sort of come piercing through the dome, which is incredible.
Yes, and they're very unexpected. Like years ago, because one of my sort of side hustles, I do architectural walking tours, and I did a walking tour on the Greenwich Peninsula, and so many people say, "What is that?" Because it's such an odd, unexpected structure. And in some ways, if you're not right next to the Blackwall Tunnel approach road, sometimes people forget that it's there. And you have to remind them that actually this is a big project with big infrastructure. It needs ventilation, the approaches. So it's never just the tunnel, the Blackwall Tunnel. It's all the kind of infrastructure around it as well. And the approaches are really quite long. It really kind of stretches its sort of tentacles on either bank.
So when I was in the boot, and you were obviously driving majestically along as a non-driver, crashing around through the tunnel, thanks for that, there was some clinking. There were quite a lot of sort of beer jars sat in the back of the boot. And I was wondering what that was about. And they're all branded Wetherspoons. What's that all about?
So I'm also going to talk about Wetherspoons, which is kind of silly because, like, with the Blackwall Tunnel, I don't actually drive, and with Wetherspoons, I don't actually drink. But again, it's something that people love to hate. And Wetherspoons, particularly recently, causes a lot of kind of polarising views. A lot of people have boycotted them. And again, like the Blackwall Tunnel, it's never just about the pubs. It's this kind of wider cultural resonance that the Wetherspoons have. So part of why I've chosen them, despite being teetotal, although they do non-alcoholic drinks, I have to say, is I think it's really interesting. Like, I'm very interested in kind of social and cultural history. And I'm also very interested in kind of now, what's going on now. One of my curatorial jobs, my job was to reflect contemporary London. So it's very interesting kind of exercise to think about what's happening now. And I think Wetherspoons really reflect that. And they really reflect how pubs have changed, how pubs are changing. I think they really reflect Britain now, how, you know, kind of polarised politically we are. They reflect cost of living crisis. You know, I think they're a really interesting barometer for what's going on in Britain at the moment, not just with pubs, but kind of wider socially. And my particular kind of interest in them is I find them really interesting in terms of how they communicate history and architecture. So a lot of what I kind of think about, particularly in my teaching, is how the public understand history and historical periods. So often when I'm teaching, I'll start entering a period by thinking about references people know, like, say, television adaptations or film adaptations. And so start with what they know and kind of bring it from there. And I think Wetherspoons has quite an interesting role in people's understanding of the past and the built environment, because so many times Wetherspoons pubs, because especially in the early days, the founder of Wetherspoons couldn't get the big breweries or the big pubs to sell to him. So he went into other buildings like retail spaces. And I mean, all of your listeners will be able to think of Wetherspoons that are in quite sort of odd and interesting and unusual buildings that are now a pub. And often the pub name will reflect the history of the area. So it could be about the place, it could be about a local person, but also inside, there's lots of interpretation on the walls about the history of the area and about the history, which I find really interesting because people must read them. And I have no idea, I'm on a quest to find out who writes these, but it's really interesting that actually there's quite a lot of history and history communication in a pub, which is really kind of unusual. I mean, pubs have always done that. They've always reflected the local area, but the way that Wetherspoons actually kind of actively has the naming, but also these interpretation boards. And also, I know a lot of people have got very excited about the carpets in Wetherspoons. I think there's a book, I don't have this book, I need to get it, about Wetherspoons carpets, but apparently a lot of the design of the carpets will often take reference to the history of their local area. So that's kind of why I've chosen them. Like, I think it's really interesting that they're a kind of cultural barometer, but also they're kind of public communication of history. I find that really interesting.
Yeah, and also, you know, they've brought back a load of quite grand or interesting or quirky buildings that otherwise would be under threat, and they've protected them by turning them back into a sort of current use and actually giving them a new life. So I used to live in Forest Hill in South London, and we had a lovely old cinema that was converted into big Wetherspoons there. And amazingly, it had this incredible David Bowie mural on the inside. So as well as kind of telling you about the actual history of the building and all that sort of stuff, as you say, they sort of bring in other kind of like local references that you know, you wouldn't necessarily expect. And there's a lot of extra effort that's gone into this stuff, isn't there, that they don't have to do. They didn't have to, you know, sure, they might not have been able to have gone into kind of traditional pub buildings, but they could have then just gone and had some fairly sort of bog standard sort of modern pub sort of buildings or sort of sheds kind of constructed that could be pubs. But they decided not to do that. They decided to sort of inhabit these quite historic buildings.
I'm glad you mentioned that, the Forest Hill one, actually, because what was it called again? It was a cinema. What was it? I totally forgot. It's shut now, isn't it?
Total blank. Yeah. I only lived there for 15 years. Not in the pub, although some would have said that perhaps that was what I was doing.
See, I used to spend a reasonable amount of time in there because this is when I did drink, and I used to work at the Horniman Museum. And that one is another reason why I find Wetherspoons interesting, because that large cinema is, like a lot of Wetherspoons, in this cavernous space, which a traditional pub, you don't normally get that. I'm also quite interested in how Wetherspoons buildings are changing pub culture, but also our behaviour in pubs, because so many pubs are, traditional pubs. If you think about, they have sections, they have snugs, they have little kind of private corners, and that's very deliberate, very typical of pubs. But then a lot of these Wetherspoons, it's just like standing in this big cavernous hall. And I think that's often why a lot of people find them very kind of soulless. I won't even get on to the food and other things, but I think that's why a lot of people find them kind of quite cold and unpub-like. And that Wetherspoons in Forest Hill, actually, in particular, something used to really bother me about that is that despite having an incredibly long bar, like a lot of pubs, people would queue at it, which is a very unpub-like thing to do. And I actually used to work as a barmaid for years and years and years whilst studying and whilst working in museums. So I find it really hard in a pub not to shout at people and try and correct their customer behaviour, because I feel like the part of me is still a barmaid. So when people used to queue in that, and I used to think, is there something about this building that people don't really think they're in a pub and they queue like they're in a shop? And it used to drive me mad. People queuing.
It's so annoying, isn't it? It's so annoying. Yeah, and also because it had such a long bar, quite often the staff were like way away because they've just finished serving something and they've had to pick something up from the other end of the bar, and then people are sort of funneled down the middle. It was very odd. It was the Capitol.
That's it, the Capitol with an O-L at the end.
Exactly.
Yes, that must have been the cinema's name.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I went into one in Ramsgate recently, which is their biggest one, which is incredible. Oh, my God, what an incredible building to have taken over. And
I've seen photos of that, but I've not been in. Yeah, remind me what kind of building it is.
It's like a sort of large Victorian, amazing kind of curved canopy. It sort of reminds me slightly of the glass houses at Kew. It's got a kind of, palm house kind of vibe to it, and it is right on the beach. That is another building. We see so many seaside buildings that sort of go to rack and ruin because people can't make them into a viable business, or they don't want to. They'd rather kind of create their own thing. So I was very pleased to see that building being sort of repurposed. But yeah, I do think that's a really, really good choice, especially because people are so snobby about them, and people were really snobby about them sort of pre-Brexit. So the Brexit vote, the fact that Tim Martin, who owns it, was such a big vocal Brexit supporter, has kind of put people off of them. But people were already quite sniffy about them. But, many an occasion on my trips around Britain where I've been writing about places, I've been rescued by a Wetherspoons curry or something. It's reliable. You know what you're getting. It tends to be open long hours. It's sort of quite a handy, trusty traveller's friend.
Yes, to be honest, that's why I started, because I've probably, like a lot of people, I don't necessarily agree at all with Tim Martin's politics, and I kind of thought, I wasn't going into Wetherspoons for quite a long time because, for similar reasons to a lot of people, I just disagreed with him politically. But then, like you, my job kind of takes me out and about a lot. And when you're on your own, especially as a woman, and you don't know where you are, you don't know the place, it is a kind of like safe pub to go to. I'm quite confident going into pubs on my own. I used to be a barmaid. I'm fine with it. But the Wetherspoons is quite kind of safe. You know what you're getting, especially now as a non-drinker. I have kidney disease, so I don't drink. So I know that I can get something that I can drink and that I can eat. So, yeah, it's the predictability of it, which a lot of people find really boring and are very snobbish about, and I totally understand. But there is a flip side of it, and that is quite useful. So, yeah, I started kind of going to Wetherspoons again a few years ago, and that's when I started noticing, especially probably like you, when you go to lots of different Wetherspoons, I started to really notice how they related to the local area, and these like historical interpretation boards inside. I started to really kind of think about that and the naming of them and the relationship with local history, and how that actually in a pub there is a lot of history communication going on, and I find that kind of interesting. So, yeah, I kind of came round to Wetherspoons. And also, especially when I first started working in pubs, 20 years ago when I was in my late teens, I never worked in a Wetherspoons. And every landlord I worked for hated Wetherspoons, absolutely hated it with a passion for their microwaved food and the cheap beer and everything. And so I was kind of brought up with that kind of opinion. And yeah, so I've kind of had a love-hate relationship with over the years, but that kind of historical communication and the architectural history, being able to actually go into these buildings and seeing these buildings actually used, not always, obviously, for their original purpose, which, now they're a pub, but it's really interesting. And there is some value being able to go into these buildings.
Definitely. So 2 brilliant choices. And I'm sure everybody is desperate now to go and drive through the tunnel or have a nice microwave curry at Wetherspoons. But before that, where can people find out a bit more about your amazing work that you do? Because you do loads of different stuff. I don't know how you have time to do everything.
Oh, no, nor do I. I'm currently freelancing quite a lot. I'm also teaching at UAL, University of the Arts London. I teach at Wimbledon and Chelsea. I also teach at KLC School of Design, which is part of West Dean. So those various teaching jobs, I'm basically teaching design history and architectural history. I also do architectural walking tours for Open City of Canary Wharf, which isn't that far from the Blackwall Tunnel, and Woolwich, which is also not that far from the Blackwall Tunnel. And then you can find me on social media, on Blue Sky, Instagram, Twitter. I'm very findable online, and as usual working on various publications as well. So yes, keep an eye out.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for a really amazing kind of enlightening and fun tour around places that people might otherwise just kind of accept or just use in a super functional way I never really think about. So it's been absolutely gorgeous. And go and have a lovely architectural walking tour of somewhere incredibly near the tunnel, and hope to see you soon. Ta-ra.